the woman history would remember as Empress Yang, was born young Maisie during a time when the southern Song court was already showing signs of fragility. The dynasty, still recovering from decades of military pressure from the Jin in the north, had retreated south to Hangzhou, where its rulers surrounded themselves with scholars, courtiers, and elaborate ceremony. It was a world where political survival depended on the ability to navigate shifting alliances, interpret unspoken threats, and understand the delicate balance between imperial authority and ministerial influence. Yang entered this environment not as a noble daughter destined for power, but as a palace attendant whose duties placed her close enough to observe the habits of those who commanded the state. In the chambers and corridors of the imperial household, she learned the rhythms of the court, the pauses in speech that concealed dissent, the subtle gestures that signaled approval, the quiet decisions that shaped the empire far more than public proclamations ever did. Her early years were defined by service rather than command, yet it was during this period that she developed the skills that would later define her reign. She witnessed how powerful men could be undone, not by open confrontation, but by the steady erosion of their standing among peers. She studied how rival factions within the bureaucracy undermined each other through petitions, how even the emperor himself relied on the constant flow of information from eunuchs and concubines. In this world, proximity to the sovereign could mean the difference between irrelevance and influence, but only if handled with restraint. Yang understood this instinctively, cultivating a reputation for discretion that made her a trusted presence in the emperor's private life, long before she held any formal title. By the time Emperor Ningzong's court began searching for new alliances within the palace, Yang had already become an indispensable figure within the inner quarters. She was elevated to the rank of consort, a position that brought her into direct contact with the emperor, while still leaving her outside the formal machinery of governance. This suited her. The emperor, known for his mild temperament and preference for scholarly pursuits over military campaigns, was often willing to delegate matters of state to his ministers. Yang used this space to deepen her understanding of the individuals who shaped policy. The scholar officials who argued for reform, the military commanders who sought more aggressive defense against external threats, and the eunuchs who managed the emperor's personal affairs. In these years, the southern Song court was facing increasing pressure from the north, as the Jin dynasty's strength remained a constant source of anxiety. The emperor's ministers debated strategies for defense, trade, and diplomacy, but their rivalries often stalled decisive action. Yang, watching from the edges of these discussions, recognized that the court's instability was not only due to external enemies, but also to the inability of its leadership to present a unified vision. She began to see that influence over the emperor's trust was the true lever of control. It did not matter who held an official seal if their access to his ear was limited. Her personal relationship with the emperor deepened during a period when he was increasingly withdrawn from direct governance. Chronic illness and disillusionment with factional politics made him more dependent on those closest to him. Yang's ability to maintain composure, to listen without judgment, and to anticipate the emperor's needs gave her a position of intimacy that no minister could rival. She was careful never to be seen as pushing her own agenda, instead framing her observations as reflections of the emperor's own priorities. Over time, these private exchanges began to shape the decisions that emerged from the palace. The transformation from attendant to political actor did not occur in a single moment, but in a series of subtle shifts in responsibility. The emperor began to rely on her judgment in matters of court ceremony, appointments within the palace staff, and even the reception of certain envoys. Each task reinforced her authority among those who understood the palace's inner workings. Ministers who once dismissed her as a figure of ornamentation began to recognize that she was a channel to the emperor himself. That recognition brought both opportunity and risk, for every favor she granted or denied marked her in the intricate web of loyalties and resentments that defined the court. Through these years, Yang refined the methods that would later allow her to survive the most dangerous transitions of the dynasty. She learned to remain unshaken in the presence of political defeat, to conceal her intentions behind gestures of compliance, and to let others believe they were acting of their own accord while following the path she had laid. In the final decades of the Southern Song, when the court seemed increasingly incapable of decisive action, she was positioning herself not as an open challenger to the established order, but as the indispensable hand guiding it from within, waiting for the moment when circumstance would demand her leadership without her needing to ask for it. Yang's position as a favored consort was never secured by beauty alone, nor by the fleeting charm that so often determined the fortunes of women in the inner palace. It was held through careful endurance, through the ability to survive each reshuffling of influence without becoming a target for destruction. The Southern Song Court was a place where favor could vanish overnight. A single rumor, a misinterpreted gesture, or the rise of a rival could erase years of standing in an instant. Many women around her fell to such turns of fortune, removed from the emperor's attention and replaced without ceremony. Yang, however, avoided these traps by never allowing herself to appear as a threat. She adopted a posture of restraint, speaking only when her words aligned with the emperor's own mood, ensuring that her presence was associated with steadiness rather than ambition. Her endurance was supported by alliances forged not in public, but in the quiet exchanges of the inner court. She cultivated the trust of senior eunuchs who controlled the flow of petitions and access to the emperor's private chambers. These men, often overlooked by high ministers, yet indispensable to the emperor's daily life, became discreet protectors of her standing. She also sought the counsel of cautious ministers who understood the value of stability within the palace and who recognized that her influence could be a buffer against more aggressive political factions. These alliances were never announced, never bound by formal declarations, but they allowed her to remain insulated from the rapid changes in fortune that swept through the court. The political climate of Emperor Ningzong's reign offered her both risk and opportunity. His preference for harmony and his aversion to open conflict meant that court factions often fought their battles indirectly, through accusations of corruption or incompetence, rather than through direct confrontation. Yang understood this pattern and avoided entanglement in disputes that could not be quietly resolved. When powerful families sought to promote their own candidates for influence within the palace, she did not oppose them openly, but ensured that her position remained secure through subtle adjustments in her alliances. This skill allowed her to outlast rivals who tried to rise quickly through bold displays of favor, only to fall when political tides shifted. Her elevation from concubine to empress was not a sudden leap, but the result of years of gradual positioning. As the emperor aged and his health declined, he relied more on those he considered dependable. Yang's reputation for calm endurance, her careful management of relationships within the palace, and her ability to avoid scandal made her the natural choice for the role. The title of Empress brought with it not only ceremonial authority, but also the right to oversee the affairs of the inner court, placing her formally in a position she had long exercised in practice. Her rise was accepted with little resistance, for by the time it occurred, her presence at the center of palace life had already been normalized. In becoming empress, she gained not only status, but greater control over appointments, court protocol, and the management of imperial resources. The eunuchs, who had once shielded her from rivals, now served under her direct authority. Ministers who had dealt with her as a private influence now had to approach her as an official power within the dynasty. While her methods remained measured, the foundation she had built through years of endurance gave her a reach that extended beyond the palace gates into the broader political life of the southern Song Court, where each decision could shift the balance between competing factions and determine the stability of the emperor's reign. As Emperor Ningzong's health declined, the balance of authority within the southern Song Court shifted in ways that few could openly acknowledge, but many could feel. His long-standing tendency to delegate responsibilities became more pronounced, and with each passing month, the volume of decisions requiring his direct attention diminished. Into this space stepped Empress Yang, whose years of measured influence had already established her as a trusted and reliable presence. She began to oversee the flow of petitions, determining which matters reached the emperor's eyes and which were redirected, delayed, or quietly resolved without his involvement. This control over information was not declared through any formal edict, but was accepted as a practical necessity, a way to shield the sovereign from the burdens of governance, while ensuring that the machinery of the state continued to operate. Her private chambers became the new axis of court activity. Ministers and envoys learned that an audience with the emperor increasingly meant first securing her consent. The rituals of the throne room persisted, but many decisions were now shaped, if not decided entirely, before they reached the formal stage. She maintained an appearance of deference, presenting her role as an extension of the emperor's will. Yet in practice, she was filtering and framing the choices before him, subtly guiding outcomes in a direction that suited her vision of stability. Her methods relied on an understanding of the court's intricate hierarchy. Who could be trusted with sensitive matters, who might exploit them for factional gain, and which policies would pass with minimal resistance if introduced under the right conditions. This growing authority was not without its tensions. Some ministers welcomed the order she brought to a court often paralyzed by rivalry, seeing in her a rare figure who could mediate between competing interests. Others viewed her with suspicion, concerned that her position as empress gave her unchecked influence without the accountability expected of an official office. Yet without a clear legal framework to challenge her role, opposition to her power remained cautious, often expressed indirectly through resistance to policies rather than direct confrontation. Her ability to manage such dissent was rooted in the same qualities that had elevated her: patience, discretion, and the careful balancing of rewards and restrictions to ensure compliance. Over time, the court adjusted to this new reality. Petitions were drafted with the knowledge that they would first pass through her hands, and officials seeking imperial favor considered her priorities as carefully as they once studied the emperor's. By shaping the court's agenda, before it reached the formal stage, she was able to influence both domestic and foreign policy without appearing to overstep the ceremonial limits of her role. Through these gradual shifts, the palace hierarchy was redefined in practice, if not in law, with Empress Yang at its center, directing the flow of governance from the privacy of her own quarters. Empress Yang's grip on the court rested not only on her ability to guide decisions, but on her skill in neutralizing those who threatened her position. She understood that influence could be eroded by persistent opposition, and that survival in the southern Song Palace demanded more than quiet persuasion. It required the calculated removal of rivals, done in such a way that their fall appeared inevitable rather than engineered. Her methods were rooted in the court's own mechanisms of control: the constant evaluation of officials, the rigid hierarchies of appointment, and the emperor's power to dismiss under the pretext of maintaining harmony. Chancellor Han Tuozhou was among the most formidable of her opponents. A dominant figure in the early years of Ningzong's reign, he had pursued an aggressive military policy against the Jin dynasty, seeking to reclaim lost northern territories. While his stance won him support among hawkish ministers and military commanders, it drained the treasury and left the court divided over the wisdom of continued conflict. Yang, concerned with preserving internal stability and wary of overextending the empire's weakened resources, viewed his influence as both dangerous and disruptive. She did not confront him directly in debate, but instead allowed his failures to accumulate in the record of the court, ensuring that when the moment came, his dismissal could be justified on practical grounds. That moment arrived as public dissatisfaction with the costly campaigns grew. Ministers who had once backed Han began to distance themselves, and Yang worked quietly to strengthen the hand of those advocating for peace. Her allies in the bureaucracy raised procedural objections to his policies, questioned the loyalty of his appointees, and emphasized the economic strain his leadership had caused. When the emperor finally withdrew his favor, it was framed as a necessary correction rather than a political purge. Han was removed from office and later met a violent end outside the capital, an event that eliminated one of the few figures capable of challenging her influence over imperial policy. In the years that followed, Yang applied similar strategies to others who resisted her direction. Charges of corruption, whether rooted in fact or in political convenience, proved effective in discrediting senior officials. Less dramatic but equally decisive were orchestrated transfers, moving troublesome ministers to distant posts where their reach could not extend into the capital's inner deliberations. Each removal reshaped the network of influence within the court, replacing adversaries with officials whose positions depended, at least in part, on her favor. These actions did not go unnoticed. Some ministers recognized the pattern and adjusted their conduct to avoid appearing as obstacles to her will. Others retreated into silence, unwilling to risk their careers by speaking against decisions already aligned with her interests. Over time, the atmosphere of the court shifted, with fewer voices able or willing to mount sustained resistance. The structure of governance itself remained unchanged in form, but the reality was that decisions moved through a narrowed channel of influence, one in which Empress Yang stood as the final arbiter before imperial approval was given. By the closing years of Emperor Ningzong's reign, the weight of governance rested almost entirely on Empress Yang's shoulders. The emperor's role had become largely ceremonial, his attention consumed by illness and retreat from political disputes. Official documents still bore his seal, and decrees were issued in his name, but the deliberations behind them were conducted in rooms where he was often absent. It was Yang who heard the petitions, who assessed the competing claims of ministers, and who determined which matters would advance and which would quietly fade before reaching the imperial desk. Her authority was not declared in any public statement, yet its presence was felt in every layer of decision-making within the palace. Foreign policy demanded particular care. The Jin dynasty to the north remained a formidable presence, its relationship with the southern Song alternating between tense diplomacy and the threat of renewed conflict. Yang managed envoys with deliberate restraint, maintaining peace through concessions that preserved the dynasty's security while avoiding commitments that might entangle the court in another costly war. At the same time, the Mongol Empire's expansion was beginning to reshape the balance of power in East Asia. Early Mongol envoys arrived in Hangzhou as observers and negotiators, testing the court's resolve. Yang recognized the need to treat these contacts with caution, offering formal courtesies while keeping military defenses alert in the background. Her attention was not confined to external threats. The southern Song heartland faced its own crises, with floods and poor harvests in several provinces straining resources and deepening unrest. Yang oversaw the allocation of relief grain from government storehouses, directing shipments to affected areas and ensuring that local officials carried out distribution without diversion. In some regions, she replaced administrators whose negligence or corruption worsened the crisis, reinforcing her reputation as both a capable manager and a leader, unafraid to remove those who failed in their duties. The public face of these actions remained the emperor's, but in the palace, it was well understood whose judgment guided the response. Through her governance, the court maintained a semblance of stability despite the broader fragility of the dynasty. Tax reforms were introduced to ease burdens on farmers in disaster-stricken areas. Military garrisons were reinforced along vulnerable borders, and the imperial bureaucracy was kept in cautious balance to prevent factional dominance. Ministers who had once opposed her influence now sought her approval to advance their policies, adapting their proposals to align with her priorities. She balanced these loyalties with care, avoiding the overconcentration of power in any single faction, ensuring that no minister could rise to a position from which they might challenge her authority. By managing the empire's diplomacy, its internal stability, and the machinery of daily administration, Empress Yang had become the central figure of the Southern Song government. The imperial signature remained a formality, but the vision, the strategy, and the final decision were hers alone, exercised with a precision that left little doubt about where true control resided within the palace walls. The death of Emperor Ningzong in 1224 marked a turning point that could have erased Empress Yang's influence in a single stroke. His reign had been defined in its later years by her governance, but with no direct heir to inherit the throne, the question of succession was both urgent and perilous. In the southern Song court, the death of a ruler without an established successor often triggered a contest of power between imperial relatives, court factions, and military interests. For Yang, the danger was immediate. Without the protection of a reigning emperor who trusted her, she risked being sidelined, confined to ceremonial duties, or even removed from political life entirely. Her survival now depended on ensuring that the next ruler owed his position, at least in part, to her decisive support. The choice fell on Zhao Yun, a young man of imperial lineage who would take the throne as Emperor Lizong. His claim was not the most obvious, but it offered Yang the best balance of legitimacy and pliability. By rallying her allies among court officials, she helped frame his selection as the natural and stabilizing choice for the dynasty. This was done through a combination of protocol and persuasion, appealing to the need for an orderly transfer of power to avoid unrest. Ministers who feared a drawn-out succession struggle aligned themselves with her position, seeing in Zhao Yun's elevation a way to prevent the fragmentation of the court. Her role in securing the succession was conducted with the same measured discretion that had defined her career. There was no open declaration of her influence, yet her presence in the inner court during the transition ensured that the decision-making process remained under her guidance. By the time the formal enthronement took place, the outcome had been settled. Zhao Yun ascended as Emperor Lizong, and Yang's standing shifted instantly from Empress Consort to Empress Dowager, a title that not only preserved her status, but also allowed her to continue exerting influence over imperial affairs. As Empress Dowager, she occupied a position traditionally reserved for the senior female member of the imperial household, often with substantial authority in the early years of a new emperor's reign. In this case, her experience in governance and her role in securing the succession made her indispensable to the stability of Lizong's court. She remained the key figure in managing palace appointments and in advising on matters of policy, ensuring continuity in both domestic administration and foreign relations. Her survival through this transition was not the result of chance, but of a carefully calculated decision, aligning herself with a ruler whose reign would begin under the shadow of her guidance. The succession crisis that might have ended her political life instead reinforced her centrality in the southern Song power structure. By backing an emperor who entered the throne without a strong personal faction, she ensured that her influence would not only survive the death of Ningzong, but adapt to the demands of a new reign, extending her reach into the next chapter of the dynasty's history. As Empress Dowager, Yang stood at the apex of imperial authority, without the shadow of a ruling husband to temper her reach. Emperor Lizong's accession had been secured through her influence, and in the early years of his reign, his dependence on her counsel was absolute. She moved with the confidence of one who no longer needed to work in subtlety. The corridors that had once been navigated through whispers now carried her directives openly. Court memorials were reviewed in her private quarters before being forwarded for the emperor's seal, and her annotations carried as much weight as the imperial signature itself. She dictated the tempo of government meetings, determined which proposals were worthy of attention, and dismissed those she deemed wasteful or destabilizing without the burden of prolonged debate. Her control over imperial appointments was both deliberate and strategic. Key posts in the central bureaucracy, went to men whose loyalty had been tested, either through long association with her household or through their role in consolidating Lizong's rule. Even military governorships in the frontier regions were subject to her scrutiny, and it became understood that advancement was as much a matter of her favor as of merit. Officials learned quickly that their survival in office depended on maintaining a posture of deference to her policies, and many aligned their actions with her priorities to avoid the risk of being displaced. This careful management of personnel allowed her to maintain a stable administrative structure, but it also meant that dissent was rarely tolerated and never left unchecked. Yang's reach extended beyond the palace gates to the empire's military borders. She maintained direct correspondence with frontier generals, bypassing some layers of the bureaucratic chain to ensure that her instructions were received without alteration. Reports on troop readiness, supply chains, and regional unrest came to her desk before reaching the Emperor's Council, giving her the advantage of shaping the court's understanding of the empire's security. By controlling the flow of military intelligence, she could decide which threats warranted immediate attention and which could be contained without alarming the broader court. This level of involvement was unusual for a woman in the Southern Song political system. Yet her position as Empress Dowager gave her the authority to act, and her long-standing mastery of court politics ensured that few dared to challenge her role. Her rule was marked by a strict division between loyalty and opposition. Those who served her faithfully found their careers advancing steadily, their families granted privileges, and their positions protected from factional rivals. Those suspected of disloyalty, however, faced rapid removal. Punishment was swift and often final, with few opportunities for appeal once her judgment was made. While these measures consolidated her authority, they also fostered an atmosphere of caution within the court, where open criticism of her policies became rare. The absence of open debate allowed her to govern without obstruction, but it also meant that the policies enacted during this period bore her singular imprint, with little tempering from alternative perspectives. Even in foreign diplomacy, her influence was unmistakable. Relations with the Jin dynasty had ended with its destruction by the Mongols, leaving the Southern Song facing the reality of a far more formidable northern neighbor. She oversaw the cautious diplomacy with the Mongol Empire, weighing the benefits of trade and peace against the need to maintain defenses. Delegations sent north carried her instructions as much as the emperor's, and the tone of negotiations reflected her preference for measured concessions over open confrontation. The stability this brought to the court allowed her to continue her domestic agenda without the disruption of major conflict, though the Mongol threat remained a constant factor in her strategic calculations. This period became known within the palace as one of order and predictability, though it was an order maintained through concentration of power and the decisive exclusion of rivals. Empress Yang had transformed the role of Empress Dowager from a ceremonial guardian of the throne into the central axis of governance, ensuring that every matter of consequence, whether civil, military, or diplomatic, passed through her authority before reaching resolution. Her dominance over the machinery of state was complete, and the court moved in step with her will. The later years of Empress Yang's dominance were marked by a change in the character of her rule. The careful balance she had once maintained between conciliation and control began to erode under the weight of prolonged authority. Years without serious challenge had convinced her that stability could only be preserved through strict centralization of power, and the measures she employed became more direct, more severe, and less concerned with the appearance of consensus. The court she presided over was one where every important decision passed through her hands, and where deviation from her line was regarded not as difference of opinion, but as a potential act of disloyalty. Those who had once approached her with open counsel now measured their words, knowing that the wrong alignment could result in dismissal or worse. Resentment took shape in places she could not fully control. The court's structure meant that even the most powerful figure depended on a web of intermediaries, and within that web, new alliances began to form quietly. Some emerged from officials frustrated by their exclusion from influence, others from those who feared that the concentration of authority in her person was undermining the emperor's legitimacy. The whispers that Emperor Xuanzong was a mere figurehead grew more persistent, sometimes reaching foreign envoys whose reports back to their own courts began to note that the southern Song was ruled in practice by the Empress Dowager. Such perceptions carried their own dangers, threatening both the dynasty's prestige and the delicate balance in foreign diplomacy. The challenge was not confined to the outer bureaucracy. Within her own household, rivalries surfaced among attendants, secretaries, and eunuchs, some of whom saw advantage in aligning themselves with factions outside her immediate circle. These internal fractures were especially dangerous because they risked undermining the flow of information on which her authority depended. In response, she tightened control over access, reducing the number of individuals who could speak to her directly or handle sensitive communications. Trust became concentrated in a smaller group, chosen as much for personal loyalty as for administrative competence. While this increased her security in the short term, it also narrowed the range of perspectives informing her decisions and deepened the perception that her rule had become closed and insular. Her policies reflected this hardening stance. Appointments were made with greater regard for proven loyalty than for administrative merit, and once in place, such appointees were expected to enforce her directives without adaptation to local conditions. Oversight intensified, with officials in the provinces more frequently recalled to the capital for evaluation. Failures in governance, whether due to incompetence, natural disaster, or factional obstruction, were met with swift punishment, reinforcing the sense that the court's primary demand was obedience. While these measures reduced open defiance, they also created a climate in which initiative was stifled, and officials hesitated to act without explicit instruction from the center. At the same time, her relationship with Emperor Xuanzong shifted. In the early years of his reign, their partnership had been marked by his reliance on her experience and her careful management of state affairs in his name. Over time, however, the growing perception that he held power only nominally began to weigh on the court's image. Ministers aware of the dynasty's need for a visibly active emperor sometimes sought to strengthen his direct rule, but these efforts rarely progressed far before encountering her resistance. The result was a subtle but persistent tension between the appearance of imperial authority and the reality of her control, a tension that neither side could fully resolve without destabilizing the court. Her foreign policy also bore the imprint of this narrowed approach. Negotiations with the Mongols, now the dominant power in the north, were handled with extreme caution, and any envoys whose counsel differed from her preferred strategy found themselves replaced. While this ensured consistency in the court's position, it also limited the flexibility needed to respond to the Mongols' shifting demands. The emphasis on maintaining control over the process sometimes came at the expense of adapting to rapidly changing external conditions, a risk that some ministers recognized, but few dared to voice openly. Within the palace, the physical spaces of her authority became more guarded. Audiences were fewer, and the ceremonial aspects of governance took on an increased importance as a display of order and hierarchy. The rituals reinforced her position at the center of court life, but they also reflected a defensive posture, a way of asserting control through the careful management of appearances. Those admitted into her presence did so under conditions that reminded them of the power she held and the cost of falling from her favor. The combination of fear, loyalty, and resentment that defined these years was not unique in the history of imperial courts, but in the Southern Song, it carried particular weight. The dynasty faced external pressures and internal vulnerabilities that made any challenge to central authority a potential crisis. Empress Yang's answer to those pressures was to consolidate her position still further, to close ranks around a trusted core, and to treat dissent, whether from ministers, envoys, or members of her own household, as a danger to be eliminated. This was governance stripped of the earlier balance between persuasion and control, replaced by an overt assertion of dominance that reshaped both the atmosphere of the palace and the political culture of the court. By the later years of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, the structure of power that Empress Yang had built over decades began to weaken in ways that were less visible than a coup or a purge, but no less decisive. Age had reduced her capacity to maintain the constant personal oversight that had once kept her network intact, and the long-serving ministers, eunuchs, and attendants who had been the foundation of her authority were gradually replaced by a new generation. These younger figures owed their advancement not to her sponsorship, but to the emperor's growing inclination to shape the court in his own image. They carried with them priorities, loyalties, and a political culture that diverged from the system she had imposed. Where her earlier rule had been marked by careful selection for loyalty above all, the new appointments reflected a broader willingness to balance factions, even if it meant empowering those who had once been cautious under her watch. The shift was gradual enough to avoid open conflict, but steady enough to erode her hold. Meetings that would once have waited for her review began to proceed without her input, and memorials reached the emperor without first passing through her hands. Some of this was the natural consequence of an aging ruler's need to prepare for the future. Some of it was a deliberate recalibration by Emperor Xuanzong, who had spent years in the shadow of her political dominance and now sought to leave his own mark on the dynasty. He did not move to strip her of titles or ceremonial honors. Such a gesture would have risked destabilizing the court. But he allowed her practical influence to diminish, replacing decisive authority with a more symbolic presence. Beyond the palace walls, the political landscape had shifted in ways that demanded new approaches. The Mongol Empire, having conquered the Jin dynasty and extended its reach deep into the north, posed an existential challenge to the Southern Song. Their military power dwarfed that of any northern rival the dynasty had faced before, and their expansionist strategies required complex negotiations, shifting alliances, and rapid adjustments in policy. Yang's approach, rooted in the careful preservation of stability and the maintenance of consistent diplomatic lines, began to appear less suited to the demands of this volatile environment. Younger ministers, eager to demonstrate adaptability, advocated for more aggressive or unconventional responses, sometimes bypassing her entirely when presenting their plans to the emperor. The erosion of her position was compounded by the loss of trusted intermediaries. Senior eunuchs who had managed her communications and ensured her directives were carried out died or retired, their replacements more inclined to serve the emperor's immediate circle. Without these channels, her ability to shape information flow, once the cornerstone of her influence, diminished. She could still summon ministers for private audiences, but fewer came seeking her guidance, and those who did often arrived more out of courtesy than necessity. The rituals of deference remained, but the practical weight behind them was lighter with each passing year. Inside the court, the atmosphere shifted from one of deference to quiet detachment. Officials who had once been careful to align themselves with her policies now calculated that their futures depended on adjusting to the emperor's preferences. Even among her household staff, the sense of inevitability that had surrounded her decisions began to fade. Some attendants maintained their loyalty out of long service, but others began to cultivate ties with emerging power centers. The subtle fragmentation within her own inner circle mirrored the broader realignment taking place across the capital. Empress Yang did not respond with open resistance. Her political instinct, refined through decades of survival, told her that a direct confrontation with the emperor's growing independence would only hasten her removal from relevance. Instead, she sought to preserve influence where she could, focusing on ceremonial functions and the occasional intervention in matters where her experience was still valued. In certain areas, the management of palace rituals, oversight of imperial archives, and decisions on appointments within the inner court, her authority remained intact. But even here, she faced quiet encroachment from those who framed their involvement as relieving her of burdens in her advancing years. The transition was as much psychological as it was political. For years, she had been the final arbiter on matters of state, the one whose approval was essential before any decision could move forward. Now, decisions were being made without her knowledge, and policies she might have opposed were implemented with the emperor's endorsement. The deliberate pace at which her authority was dismantled reflected a desire to avoid destabilizing the court, but it also ensured that by the time her influence was visibly diminished, the structures that had once supported her power were already beyond recovery. While the outward form of respect remained, the reality was that her role in governance had shifted from active command to symbolic oversight. The same walls that had once enclosed her center of power now confined her to the margins of decision-making. The court still bowed in her presence, but the momentum of the dynasty had moved elsewhere, carried by new voices, new priorities, and a ruler who no longer felt the need to defer to the woman who had once placed him on the throne. The death of Empress Yang closed a chapter in the history of the Southern Song that had been defined by her presence for more than 3 decades. She had entered the palace as a figure of little consequence and left it as one of the most consequential political actors of her age, shaping the course of a dynasty without ever formally ruling it. Her passing removed a central point of authority that had, for much of Emperor Ningzong's and Emperor Lizong's reigns, anchored the court's decision-making. In the immediate aftermath, the palace continued its ceremonies and routines, but the absence of her oversight was felt in the slower pace of resolutions, the cautious maneuvering of ministers unaccustomed to operating without her direction, and the gradual redistribution of influence among competing factions. Without her to impose the discipline she had long maintained, the delicate balance within the court began to shift. The emperor, now firmly in control, faced the challenge of governing without the stabilizing force or the restrictive oversight she had provided. For some, this was a moment of liberation, an opportunity to pursue policies that had been set aside under her watch. For others, it was the beginning of uncertainty, as the structures of loyalty she had enforced through patronage and fear dissolved. The court that emerged in the wake of her death was less centralized, and while this allowed greater room for ministerial initiative, it also meant that factional disputes, once contained by her authority, began to re-emerge with greater intensity. Beyond the palace, the dynasty stood at a crossroads. The Mongol Empire's advance had already altered the balance of power in East Asia, and the southern Song's position was increasingly precarious. Yang's cautious diplomacy had bought time, preserving the peace long enough for the court to avoid immediate subjugation. But her resistance to more aggressive reforms had left the dynasty vulnerable to a threat that could no longer be delayed. In the decades following her death, the Mongol pressure intensified, and the internal unity she had enforced proved difficult to replicate. The loss of a central unifying authority at a time of mounting external danger weakened the court's ability to respond with coherence. Historians have long debated whether her reign behind the throne prolonged the life of the Southern Song, or whether it contributed to its eventual fall. Her supporters argue that her consolidation of power prevented the kind of instability that could have hastened the dynasty's collapse, pointing to her role in managing succession, maintaining internal order, and guiding policy through periods of diplomatic and domestic challenge. Her critics contend that her reliance on loyalty over innovation, her suppression of dissent, and her centralization of authority stifled the development of a more resilient governing structure, one that might have adapted more effectively to the Mongol threat. Both views find evidence in the historical record, and neither fully resolves the paradox of her legacy. In the end, she remained a ruler without a title that matched her influence, a woman who shaped the fate of an empire from behind ceremonial veils, whose authority was both absolute in practice and invisible in law. Her methods were rooted in survival, honed in a court where hesitation could be fatal, and they succeeded in preserving her position across the reigns of two emperors. Yet the same concentration of power that allowed her to maintain stability also meant that, when she was gone, there was no clear successor to her role, no enduring system to hold the court together in the same way. Her death was not the cause of the dynasty's eventual downfall, but it marked the moment when the Southern Song lost the figure who had, for better or worse, defined its politics for a generation.